good, y'all? My name is Dr. Eric House, and I am on the chopping block at visceralchange.org.
Welcome back, everybody, to this episode of the Chopping Block. Got a very special guest with us. My good brother, Dr. Eric House, is in the building.
Sorry, sir.
Dr. House, how's it going, man?
Feeling good. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm glad you're here, man. Dr. House is coming all the way from New Mexico, where you are an assistant professor of critical composition and writing studies. Is that correct?
Yep, that's right. That's right. Las Cruces, New Mexico.
And this is New Mexico State University.
Correct.
Indeed. I'm excited to talk a little bit about this journey and how you wound up there. But before we do anything, I just have to know, what is your take on the current state of hip hop, man?
I'm at that age where I'm fully recognizing that the best rappers for me, or the most influential rappers for me, were like in the mid 2000s to like the mid 2010s. And I'm fully okay with accepting that I'm getting washed. You know what I'm saying? So as far as the current state, like I'm a big fan of letting the kids have their things. You feel me? Like, and recognizing that those new rappers or the new movements in hip hop are important for them as they kind of go through their things. Because like I think about my freshman year in college, right. And I'm in my early 30s, right? So we were dancing to like New Boys and like rappers who, objectively speaking, I'd be like, nah, that wasn't it. But like at the moment, it was important for us. So I think I remember those times. And I remember like I did have the rappers who were influential to me at that age, like the Kendrick Lamars, the J. Cole's, the Kanye, before the recent Kanye, right?
Right.
And so I think about the changes, and like my older cousins hated the rappers I loved, and that's just how it was.
And that's how it is. So, across the board. I mean, you think about that narrative there generationally. You'll have the parents like, "What are you doing listening to this? This isn't music. This is music."
Ain't real hip hop.
Put on somebody else, right? Right.
Of course. So I mean, I think that hip hop. People who kind of identify within the hip hop nation, hip hop generations, we don't really do well with time. And I think we don't really think about what it means to grow up and what it means to let the younger generations have their things. So I know that newer music ain't for me. Every now and then I'll hear somebody and I'm like, oh, okay, he got it. Like Corday. I'm a big Corday fan.
Okay.
But then I can only probably name like one song, or listen to like one song from his album. And that's cool. Whereas the rest of them, they might be super influential. I was actually having a conversation with my students. Most of them are between 18 and 21 years old. They're just throwing names out that I've never heard about. And they're looking at me like I'm crazy. And then I'm like, but do y'all know who Nas is? They're like,
who?
But then you're right, but I think about like most of them were born in 2000, so it's like, of course you don't know who Nas is.
Right, of course, and I think you made a good point that's often, I just think, not talked about, forget missed. This idea of we don't do well with time, and I think about that even in sports as well, you know. And I'm guilty, man. I'm so old school. It's not even it's not even worth expressing. I mean, you for me, I separate hip hop and rap, and for me, hip hop is the movement. It's the social justice discussion.
Yeah.
It's the 5 elements. It's smack. It's streets, music, arts, culture, and knowledge. Right. To get into the game. Let's say my time I consider strong for me is going to be the 90s.
Yeah.
If you take a look at 90s hip hop and R&B, you can't be a YouTube sensation and hop in there. You either had it or you did not. And the roster was stacked. And when I think about sports, same way. I mean, people talk about this Michael Jordan, LeBron James debate. I'm like, where's the debate? What argument? What are you talking about? Right. Yeah. So I feel you. I appreciate you mentioning that, because this idea of time is something that is interesting when you explore it in this way. Well said.
Definitely.
Do you have a favorite rapper of all time?
All time. Ooh, that's a good question. It changes a lot, and I always try to keep like 3 on rotation as like my favorites.
Okay.
So I got to go Kendrick.
Okay.
Mostly because like I was a fan with like Overly Dedicated and Section 80 came out. Like I really enjoyed those, but like Good Kid, Mad City, that was like the anthem.
Everybody leans on that.
Yeah. And then I just love how he stayed experimental with the sound, like when To Pimp a Butterfly came out, like that you really felt the funk influence. And my pops is a huge funk music fan.
Indeed.
So for me, that just made some connections for me. And then of course, Damn is a great album. Clearly,
right.
Was it Pulitzer? What was the award he got? He got some sort
of yeah, he did, didn't it? Something like that. Yeah.
So, anyways, I think he's always been like a soundtrack to me growing up and really becoming an adult. I'm a big Crit fan too, just because. So my dad's from Mississippi, moved to Chicago when he was younger. So I feel like I have like every time I see that family, I have like a lot of Southern vibes that I never really got to fully understand and explore what that meant.
Right.
And so that's why I kind of lean on like Southern hip hop music, like the Outkast, the UGKs, right?
Makes sense.
And I think that Big Crit is a more contemporary version of that sound that I really identify with. Right. He makes what I call like car music, right? Like when you're just driving slow with the windows down, bumping the bass up. So I'm a big Crit fan. And then for that third spot, it changes a lot. But I think right now I'm still on my Rhapsody movement. Okay. Her last album, Eve, just was really dope to me.
Rhapsody.
And I think she's one of the MCs who is. I don't think she's ever going to break mainstream. But I don't think she wants to break mainstream. Right. I think and I think the message in her last album was very clear. Like I know who I'm talking to, and this population needs me to say that message. And I just think lyrically, she's just elite. Like,
and that matters. And I was having this conversation with my guys the other day, not about Rhapsody, although that's not a name you hear often, right, in these discussions, but talking about what I say. I think I said, I said, who's underrated in the conversation around like just lyricism and just quality of bars? Who? And I'll say it to you as well. B.O.B. And I gotta be honest with you. I don't love the dude. I don't have his albums, but when he flows, I'm like, wait a minute. It's you know what I mean? Underrated, like Gold Dust of WWF back in the day, type underrated. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, I think people are afraid of saying B.O.B. because of the whole flat Earth like controversy that when that came out.
They'll say Kyrie though, no problem.
That's facts, right? But he, especially in like the early 2010s, he had a moment. And I don't know if he's came up with new music recently, but definitely,
he did have
got to give it up to him.
They got to, right. I mean, I wouldn't put him in there with the elites. Don't get me wrong, but just my guy has always been Nas.
Yeah.
Big, sort of the standard folks you think about.
How'd you feel about King? Did you hear King Disease too?
I didn't. No, not yet.
Okay.
Not yet. But anytime you get a chance to get up there with the symphony orchestra, which obviously prior to this, you got to make sure that he's in this discussion moving forward. Anyway, so I'm excited to hear more about hip hop and in particular how it pertains to the work that you do as a professor. But before we fast forward, let's go back in time a little bit.
Yeah.
Now, I know you were born in California, but you were raised here in Tucson to such a degree where you might quite possibly be the only, if I may, Black Tucsonan, right, native Tucsonan to a degree that I've ever met. Being here in Tucson. Talk to me, man. Talk to us. What was it like growing up in Tucson? And being raised here.
Yeah. It was. Identity politics is something I kind of had to come to terms with quite young, for a lot of reasons. Because most of my friends, most of my different groups in different spaces, but most of my school friends, I'll say, their parents were either from Mexico or from Central America, and so they're mostly first generation Latinx kids, and so that was how I saw, like, just seeing myself indifferent in a lot of those spaces. Like, I knew that I wasn't really in that culture, but I was heavily influenced by that culture. But at the same time, Tucson has a very unknown Black community. There's a lot of reasons why it's not really known anymore. So my mom grew up in the area that they call Sugar Hill, and Sugar Hill is like fighting gentrification all the time. Like, for example, the house my mama grew up in, once my grandfather passed away, they had to sell it. And then the university bought it up, and now it's like you see some historical looking houses, and there's all of a sudden these huge college looking houses, right? So a lot of that neighborhood is getting bought up. So that's the reason why we don't really hear from them. But like, I mean, growing up, I knew the Langfords, who were a kind of a larger Black family in Tucson. I knew their kids. The kids were my age. Well, the grandkids, I should say, were my age. And so we went to school together. My guy, Brian Hill, his family is also from Tucson. He grew up in that same, his dad grew up in that same area, knew my mom. My boy, Jeremy, his dad, the Joes, they grew up down that street too, same area. It's like you don't really hear about these families because, we grow up and we move, a lot of the kids move away. But and at the same time, the unfortunate reality is as we move away, there's really no one to kind of stay and hold those houses and keep that neighborhood, hold those houses down. And so they get bought up and that history kind of gets forgotten. But they were there. And so I always kind of knew about the Black history in Tucson specifically. And then you have church communities where the church I went to was predominantly Black. All the churches I went to in Tucson growing up are predominantly Black. And so I have some of my best friends, they lived on the other side of town. I don't really know their family's history in the same way, but you know that there is a presence there. But I mean, I go back to the original point. I had to know about identity politics early because I was in high school at the time when Tucson Unified School District was having battles with the Mexican American studies, and this was the reason why they started the conversation about HB 2281, which is the ethnic studies ban. Like, I was in the auditorium when Dolores Huerta, she was a speaker that came in, and line, her famous line, right, was Republicans hate Latinos, and like that got the attention of all the school board, right? So that's where Tom Horn and all those dudes came through and was trying to shut it all down. Unfortunately, I felt like that was a moment where, as Black students, we saw the ramifications for that, but I don't know if we had a voice. And if we did, and I don't know that I was involved or had the opportunity to be involved in those conversations. Partly I was 15, 16 years old. So I don't know. I was worried about who we were playing that night. But at the same time, I don't know. I know a lot of the teachers I knew gave us space to talk about it, but I don't know if anyone ever sat down and was like, as a Black man growing up in Tucson, Arizona, it seems like this battle is with Mexican American studies and the school district, but at the same time, what they're going to do is take away ethnic studies in general, which implicates you as well. So let's talk about how it's not just this them versus them, but it's all y'all versus them. But we didn't really have that chance to make that connection. And I think in the Southwest specifically, you see a lot of situations where Blackness kind of gets folded into these racial conversations that you never think about until it happens. That reminds you that race is it's not always like there's categories, but at the same time, the project of racialization that I knew to understand growing up in Tucson was whiteness is the force that we're all kind of pitted against, and that's used to order and rank our bodies. So that's something I had to sit with and grow with. And I think it's something that I kind of went through in my grad studies to really help start to put a language for and make sense of. And I wish I had the opportunity back then to have the sort of conversations that I'm kind of in now, but that's the journey, right? So I can't be too upset with that.
Yeah, of course. We all go through that.
Yeah.
You made a lot of fantastic points there, man. A couple I wanted to double back off of. You talked about the neighborhoods. I think you said your grandfather's house, and just some of these more traditionally Black-owned houses that have been swallowed up in the university. You talked about Sugar Hill. I know the Dunbar is another area. The Dunbar Center for years, the University of Arizona has been trying to get their hands on that. And they've just been fighting and keeping it within the city. And I'm going to ask you a question at the tail end that's going to tie back to this point here about the Black community and ownership, right? So we'll table that for now. It just reminded me of that. And your contrast and juxtaposition between being Black and brown versus whiteness in the context of Tucson. I remember when I first moved here, So one of the first things I recognized when I first moved here was that the overtness of racism was a little bit different, even the covertness, and the players in the conversation here in the Southwest were different. I remember being out one night and a bouncer who I'm cool with, white guy, in conversation, he said to me, some Latino person was singing at karaoke. And he says to me, these Mexicans, man, like, we gotta do something about this, right? Now, this is a white guy saying it to me. Now, listen, I'm from Boston. Back east, the conversation is not white, brown, it's white, Black. So this is the first time I came and I realized, like, wait a minute, here's a white guy who feels comfortable
Yeah.
being racist to me, a black dude, with no problem. Right. And so that's the first time it dawned on me, like, wow, like this is, in the eyes of some of these white folks, practically, not systemically necessarily, but immediacy, I'm not the threat, and I'm not the threat in the same way. And it was profound for me to learn that. Which brings me to my last point here that I wanted to double back on what you mentioned. When I moved to Tucson, in my research, I found that the city was about 5% Black, which is about the same it is today. And then the state of Arizona at the time was about 4.3% Black. You came up in these numbers. You talked a little bit about this identity. Talk to me about the ways in which class may have permeated that and affected your experience, if at all, being one of only, for example, 5% Black folks growing up, and then maybe in a particular area as a result.
I think the unfortunate reality is that I don't think at the time I really thought about the influences of class, mostly because, and this is where it gets really messed up and insidious, right? It's like the class conversation was kind of conflated in the race conversation. So the assumption was like most of the Black families had no money. Most of the Black families had no land. Most of the Black families didn't own their homes.
Correct.
But I also recognize that my family, my parents at least, in relation to their siblings, were definitely the first. Since my grandparents owned their home, they were the first to like purchase a home. One of the first. Some others did too. There were some of the few to purchase their homes. Like my mom's one of 7 or 8. My dad's one of like 11. And so just percentages wise, there was like 1 or 2 within each family. 2 or 3 within each family who like were able to get degrees, purchase homes, and then like start to kind of try to build some form of wealth. But I didn't really understand what that meant, because that was something that was never talked about.
Right.
And even then, like I fully recognize the privileges that like, so I'm married to a white woman, and for her, it was second nature to say like, oh, we need to talk about what having a financial planner. We need to talk about what it means to buy a house instead of renting a house. And for me, I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, we're good, right?
The house is a house, right?
But I don't understand, and I didn't understand that like when you're paying a mortgage, you're essentially, I mean, it's a loan you're paying off, but like every time you pay something, you're adding more value to your overall profile.
House. That's right.
Right. So you're not just throwing rent away or throwing rent away. But I'm that's not to say I don't want to slander anyone who has to rent or anything like that. That's not my point. My point is to say that like these aren't the conversations that I even knew existed.
Right.
So I didn't even know what questions to ask because I didn't know what this field that I'm now a part of is doing. So I think that's one thing. I'm trying to get at the whole question about how your question was, how does class figure into these conversations?
Right, and you're running the money.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. So I didn't have the language for that because I think class was so conflated and we didn't talk about it. We didn't talk about the struggles we had, right? We didn't talk about if someone needed money, what does it mean that I'm the assumption was what we had, we should share with everyone else. It wasn't, and which I think is still a thing we should live by. But it was just like money was much more like, this is how you get through the week versus this is how you save it and build it for generations.
Right.
And so in a lot of ways, that's where Black families in the Southwest specifically, I think that's a shared lived experience that I think a lot of Black families across the nation can agree with, is not even have the language or the literacy, the financial literacy to talk about these things. And that's more or less how some of these things get, I guess, repeated in generations, is because we just didn't know. But I think it's powerful to be able to sit there and say, yeah, it is racially motivated. The reason why we don't have these literacies is because of race, but we should also call out the class part of race in order to really understand what these systems do to kind of keep people in certain positions in certain spaces. Right. But yeah, I think that's how I would approach that conversation.
Beautiful analysis, man, really, because, and as you were tightening up in the back end there, I'm here to tell you as well that it is certainly sort of a national discussion or experience for Black folks. As you're talking, I'm like, yep, I remember walking into the office in the projects with my mom to pay the rent and get the little Tootsie Pop off the shelf and head back. And for me as an 8-year-old, 6-year-old, it didn't mean anything to me. This is the process was. I didn't realize that the projects were the projects. I didn't see race in the same way because everybody in the projects, as diverse as we were, I grew up in the most diverse city in Massachusetts, statistically. As diverse as we were, we all had the same issues. And it was just different for Black folks because the way out wasn't dependent upon a begrudging relative who wants you to learn your lesson. And now that you learn your lesson, we have a soft place for you to land. The way out for us was scratching and clawing through a system, right? And paying off, what was supposed to be a 30-year-old mortgage 60 years down the road, right? And family to family to family. Because we don't have that information you just talked about, right? And the financial literacy. I know I didn't get it, not to say that my parents were uneducated or didn't have access to it.
Same here.
You find yourself in situations, I know now as a parent, right, where, and my situation is very different than my own. So I'm not trying to suggest that it's not, but I do know that you make calls, make decisions that you either want your kids to be a part of or not be a part of, right? And in your mind, for the sake of their protection, whatever the case is. And I think for some of us as Black folks, it's, do I put this money away? I have $5. Do I save 2 of it and put 3 here, or do I need all 5 for the gas tank, to make something happen, And so the analysis is strong because it's very real for all of us.
And even just thinking about the reason why a lot of Black families come out to the Southwest. One of Arizona's largest crops was cotton, right?
Right.
And so it's like, you think about the economic motivations for that. It's like, there are still some legacies of, not to say that is because of slavery, but it's like, you think about the skills that they had and the only thing that they were able to do, what choice do you have, right? So even the economic motivation just going there. My grandparents were laborers, and my grandma worked in the houses of many prominent white women, right? Like cleaning and cooking things like they were laborers, right? So it's not like out here was this great opportunity where we're going to change generations. It's like, no, you just got to kind of do it. It was still this very much a survival. What can we do and what are our options? So, yeah.
Right. Yeah. Without a doubt, man. I had the honor of listening to you on the Black Excellence in Higher Ed podcast right there at NMSU. How old was that podcast?
We did that maybe a year ago now.
Nice. Yeah.
So not very old. Yeah.
It sounded great. You went in. You said a lot of fantastic stuff, which helped me formulate some thoughts for our interview today. I didn't want to double back per se, although I have a different audience. But I did want to take it as an opportunity to tackle another area where you and I connect, which is basketball. And earlier on in the podcast, you talked about how, you talked about playing basketball throughout life and then making the tough decision to walk away. And I know how tough that is and can be. And I've always considered basketball a teacher of life. I'm not talking just, how to shoot with your elbow in, or how to take a little bit of contact, Euro. I'm talking about how to lose. You know what I mean? With dignity and respect. How to win. How to deal with adversity. You know what I mean? How to become a part of a team, right? In our case, brotherhood. Talk to me, man, and talk to the audience about what you learned from playing basketball. What you learned from your decision to turn away from it, and then, of course, what you've carried with you as a result of this experience.
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, I think everything you talked about, like the lessons, how to lose with dignity, how to win with dignity, right? How to stay ready, right? How to prepare all the way. I think those are any team sport anyone can play. I think these are the lessons that you should walk away with. Yes. And then it is my hope that if I could sound like I'm getting old, which hey, it is what it is. That's the thing that I really hope a lot of like these younger generations where AAU is really like a prevalent space, and like Instagram is, we didn't have Instagram back then when I played. So it was like, there wasn't these opportunities to watch these highlight tapes. I think my generation started the highlight tape because that's when YouTube was really popping. Right. But I think some of that stuff might get lost with team sports. So any team sport, I think those are the lessons you learn. But I think what I took from the game, and the reason why I loved it, I'm a very, what's the word? Like, I love about basketball to like think things through a couple of steps, to maybe see how plays develop, be able to anticipate how plays develop. I was also, for both high school and club teams specifically, I was really big on defense, because that was the one thing. I was undersized, so I played like 4 or 5 sometimes.
Oh, that's right.
So I'm 6'5" and good, in a good pair of basketball shoes, I'm 6'5". And so I was going up, especially in club, I was going against dudes, and college, going against dudes who was like 6'8" and up, 6'8", 6'9".
I get it.
Couple of footers, right? Yeah. And so it's like you have to anticipate movements. You have to know this dude loves to go to his right shoulder. So once he goes, I need to be quicker. I got to jump it. Right. And so it's like the cerebral part of it is I think what I really loved. Yes. And so I think that's one thing that translates to every aspect of life, is like always kind of being critical. And I think that's why I love academia. Well, I love what I do, not academia. I love research.
I got you.
I love writing, reading, and researching. I don't necessarily love academia. We can get to that later though. But it's because it's this idea of like, shout out to my guy, Jose Cortez, who also went to U of A. He described theory as like trying to imagine what's right around the corner, even though you can't quite see it.
Right. I like that.
I think that's one thing I really loved about basketball for me, is like because I was undersized, I think I was good because I was able to always anticipate what might happen. And most of the times I was right. So the critical thinking, believe it or not, is I think the biggest thing I take away. And I don't think a lot of people really might associate that with sports, but that's one thing I loved about it. And even watching, that's one thing I love to this day when I'm watching any level of basketball. I love to like try to look at the whole play. Who's setting the back screen? Who's, where's the shooter? Or how are they curling around the screen? Are they they're flaring around the screen? Like those sort of buildups. Everyone loves to watch the ball handler, but I love to watch like how it all plays out, right?
And it's funny you say that, because that's exactly why I stopped watching the NBA in particular.
I get it.
For me, it became a little too commodified for what the product was historically putting out. You got the 12th man, like, man, you tell me I can make 3.7 million and not get in? Shoot, right? And kind of kick back, and yeah. What did it for me, and I'm going to toss the microphone back to you. What did it for me is that I used to own the DVD, The Ultimate Jordan. It was like a 3-part set of DVDs, and that came with a couple of full games with it. Had the 86 playoff game 2 when he puts up 63 on the Celtics, Jordan.
Celtics, yeah.
He got the 92 finals where the Bulls versus the Trailblazers. And you also had the 93 finals, the Bulls versus the Suns. Of course, you had the Jazz in there as well, the 98. And I was watching Bulls versus Suns one day. Tip goes up. Cartwright gets it over to BJ. BJ hits the top of the key and runs the play. Backdoor screen. Scottie Pippen goes behind, a little alley-oop layup, right? Everybody goes back down court except the best player in the world. Michael Jordan stands 94 feet, gets low, and picks up Kevin Johnson all the way back.
Full court. Okay. Oh, yeah.
And I watched this in 2009. And I made the decision at that point in time, actively. I said, I can't watch basketball no more. You're telling me the best player in the world is supposed to be LeBron James?
As good as it gets, right? Yeah.
Right. I don't see him today picking up 94. I rattled off a list of people. And remind you, I'm in Boston. This is when the big three were there, right? So I'm making this tough decision with KG, Ray, and Paul Pierce right there, right? And so I say all that to say, I'm a student of the game like you, and I'm less interested in the flashy, and I want to know who's boxing out to get that board. I want to know if the layup is educated, as I like to say. Who's shooting from foul line extension, who's trying to shoot threes, who's doing what, right? So I wanted to chime in and say I can appreciate the value in that, because the cerebral component is super critical. So now, what about some of the adversity and what you learned how to push this?
I think there's the physical tolls, right?
Right.
But that I think we always walk away from. One of the things that when I reflect on, I was low key injury prone, like never seriously injured, but I was always banged
spraying
up,
here and there,
which most people are, but like there's like everyone's bruised up and kind of and beaten in that way. But I was always sprained up. Right. If it wasn't a knee, it was an ankle. If it was an ankle, it was my shoulder. You know, right. Always something that you can still play through, but like, so I kind of learned to understand what that's like and to go with that. But I think as far as adversity is concerned, that's where my story to decide to walk away kind of comes in for me. Right. Because I mean, mind you, I was playing basketball organized basketball since kindergarten, as most of us do, right? On some, whether it's the YMCA or it's some other league that someone got going on. And so like in a lot of ways, basketball was my identity and the way I was also made visible in Tucson. Like people in Tucson, I mean, I might have talked about this on the other one too, but it's like that's the way I kind of felt validated. It's because I was good at it.
Right.
So, you know, I felt that everyone could always ask me, how's the team going to be this year? And it's like, knowing that there's other, I'm gonna love hoops forever. Like there's no way around it. It's been central to my life, but of course I think the adversity was like, what does it mean when the thing that you have identified with so long is not giving you the same thing that it was giving you before? Right. Which I kind of realized. I kind of had that realization in like high school. Like it wasn't giving me the same thing that it was back in middle school. Especially senior year in high school, I was like, I might be done. But you know, that's how I identify. It's all I knew. So I got to at least try it. And then you make it. You're like, oh, I'm supposed to be here, which you know, that's fine. But I think the decision to really understand like basketball is going to be there in my life. It's just going to look different, and that's okay. And I don't have to be the dude who's either on the court or on the bench, or you know, because I mean, not for nothing. At NAU, I was like I maybe averaged 2 minutes a game, only because I played like garbage minutes at the end of the games, right? And like I was definitely I was the dude who's like on the bench, like holding people back when we're celebrating. Like I mean, it's not like I was out there, right? Like so it's not like I was a star or anything like that, but it's just like that's all I knew. But it's getting to that realization that it can be in your life just in different ways. So what really feeds me at that time, and that's where I made the switch to English. Is like, okay, I really love just that space of education and what that does, and thinking long term, that's going to feed me much more than basketball ever can in that space. Right. Like basketball, I still love to go play pickup when I can. Of course, it's my favorite way to try to stay in shape, right? But like, it can't be my 9 to 5, and that's fine. It doesn't mean I'm any less than anyone else for that reason. It's just. Right. It is what it is. So, you know,
and it reminds me slightly of, you know, first DMX, you know, love it, let it go, you know, and if it comes back, that's how strong it was. You know what I mean? And, you know, but when you talked about, you know, thinking about using basketball as a sense of validation to a degree, it also made me think about, what does it mean, or who are you without it? Almost, you know, it reminds me of the Avengers when Captain America and Iron Man are into his face, and Iron Man hits him with that everything cool about you comes out of a bottle or whatever. And Cap fires back is like basically saying like, take off the suit,
take off the shield, the suit.
Let's see who you are. Like then let's see, right? And you know, something, you know, as you've used to define you, that you've relied on, that's given you the perks. Or if you want to find a decent analogy, the privilege, really, if we're talking about justice, take that off. Now let's see who you are. Who are you without this enhancement to people, right? And you found English in a particular way, which is actually going to segue into my next question for you. Did you always have a love for English and writing?
I did. I mean, I'm just thinking as far as back as like middle school. Wow. It was a space where I love to play with. I mean, I'm a music fan too, so that kind of comes with it. And for music, I always loved like the stories, and the experience that people can kind of share within language specifically. Like I love the actual like instrumentation of things, but what I understand more is like the lyrics. So like and I mean I remember it's either 7th or 8th grade. Like we wrote a poem about. I think it was 7th grade because it was like the year after 9/11, which was 2001. Right. We like they wanted us to write a poem to submit to some middle school anthology or something like that. And my teacher was like, this is really good. And so I guess it's speaking to that validation, and just like, I think whatever we do, anytime someone who's like mentoring us in that space can like say like, oh, I see you, I see what you're doing, that validation is important. And that's part of the reason why I love education, because I think as educators, it's our role to constantly do that for all that we encounter. And so I think that was moments where I was like, oh, I'm kind of good at this. And not only am I good, but it's like, when I do it, it feels good for me too.
Right.
And that was just highlighted even more so in high school, and even more so in undergrad, and especially in grad school, certain moments in grad school.
Right.
So I think when you have people saying, like, kind of affirming that, at the same time, it also feels good for you. I think that was the space that English has always been for me.
And then you sort of took this experience and you journeyed throughout undergrad, and then for folks who don't know, that's Northern Arizona University. And you got a degree in English, right? Your bachelor's.
Yep.
And then you went on and did your graduate work at the University of Arizona.
Back home, yep.
Yeah, right back here in the Tucson, where you got your PhD, at least in RCTE, Rhetoric, Composition, and the Teaching of English.
Yep.
And so is it safe to assume that being a professor was always the goal?
Yeah,
was it something you fell into? Okay.
Sort of. I mean, I always haven't had an affinity for the space of education. My parents are educators, and they were really good at what they did. They ended up being administrators, and I think that might kind of signal why I was interested in some form of administration, which, once you're in it, you're like, I got a couple of hot takes about administration, but
okay.
So the space of education always made sense to me. But so when I quit basketball, it was my sophomore year, around October, November. I think it was October, my sophomore year. I was really just like, it was the first time, because I mean, like I said, basketball has been my main thing since kindergarten.
Right.
Like at kindergarten, you're not really serious about it. You're just like, what do you like to do? I like to play basketball.
Right.
By the time you start middle school, it's like club. So it's like, outside of the school season, you always have club basketball to look forward to, which lasts from spring to the next fall.
Right.
And then by the time you're in high school, you're always anticipating. I played other sports, but you're always anticipating basketball season.
Waiting to happen.
That was the best team I was a part of in high school. My football team was not good, and so it was like you always had that to look forward to. So it was the first moment where I was like, all right, Eric, who are you? What do you like to do? Right.
Yep.
And so that's when I thought about it, and it was like, I'm just gonna make this choice. I'm not even gonna worry about what job's gonna look like. I just need to be in a space. I know I needed to still do college, because that was the space where I felt mattered to me. And so I was like, okay, what can you stand studying? What can you stand, even if you don't like the deadline or the amount, what content area can you sit through and be like, you know what, even though I don't really like this at the time, this is the content I can sit through. And then what's going to give me moments of edification? What's going to give me the moments where I really do rock with the finals and stuff like that? And that was English. And I had a couple of advisors at Northern Arizona who, they, once again, kind of speaking to this, not only did they affirm me, but what they were affirming also mattered to me.
Right.
One of my advisors was like, have you thought about grad school? And I was like, nah, I mean, maybe, I don't know. Sure. Like, what's that like? And then she just told me because it was more so that they were seeing that I had the capacity to like sit through certain theoretical concepts and think through what they meant and try to apply that to my lived experience. And so at U of A, I was first in the master's. I wanted to do PhD, but I honestly didn't know what grad school looked like. And I'm so glad I was in the master's at first, because that first semester just like it was a lot.
I couldn't jump into a PhD right away, so I don't know how people do it.
It was a lot. And I mean, U of A's master, I don't know what it's like now, but at the time they didn't really pay attention to the master's program. So I was in class with a bunch of PhD students, and I think my instructors knew I hope they knew I was a master's student. So I think how they assessed my work was on that level, and I'm so thankful for that, because it was a lot. So yeah, but like once I'm in that space, I'm like, and this is why I think, apart from my mentors at U of A, I really, really appreciate my colleagues, especially the ones who were there with me when I was first, second year masters, because they were so amazing in that class space. And I saw how they were doing their work, and I was like, it was like inspiring. I was like, the way that they're able to break down topics is a way that I want to also do it, because that looks like everything I want. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. So I think that was a moment when I was like, okay, this is what being a professor could be like. If we're able to be very critical about these concepts that a lot of people just assume. But then like they do have some long-reaching implications, especially when we start to get to the conversations of like power dynamics within language instruction and all these things like that.
Yes.
So yeah, I always gotta shout out my colleagues in grad
Yeah.
school, because they were the ones who showed me like, oh, this is what it could be.
Mentorship, guidance, man. I was having this discussion the other night with a couple of fellows, Black men, talking about how the Black community in some ways lacks that, and we can be a lot better at it. You know, I know I came up in student affairs versus the academic affairs. So we're talking Res Life in particular, admissions, you know, the bookstore, places like this, the other half of the campus. And I had wonderful Black male mentors who, as I always say, showed me how to walk, showed me how to talk, right, in my identity in these predominantly white spaces, and who took an interest in me, took care of me, really. But also, right, there were some white folks in there who were allies, right, and advocates, and who had access to different elements of the discussion, who were willing to say, you know, in this particular field now, here's how you might want to show up and how you might want to examine the way this arrives in these different ways. Just curious, any particular reason you decided to stay in Arizona for undergrad and/or grad?
So, I mean, I'm not, so I didn't really know that a lot of people chose grad school for like, I want to study with this person. I still thought it was,
same.
I didn't know. So I was like, I'm going to go home. I only applied to Arizona. I applied to all 3 Arizona schools. And so this is how the choice happened. So just to break it down, I was at NAU. At the time I wanted to stay at NAU. They also had a master's in rhetoric program. It was all online, but they were like, oh, but since you're here, you can always come into our offices and chop it up with us, whatever. So I applied to NAU, ASU, and U of A, got into all 3, but the funding packages was the issue. NAU put me on a wait list. And was like, you can either pay for it, or if something happens and some people decline, then you'll be next up. And I was like, I mean, I guess I'll just hang on, because I guess I'll wait. ASU, I want to feel like they said the same thing, where it was like wait list. I actually applied to the PhD. I should have applied to the MA in hindsight, but I applied to the PhD at U of A. At first, didn't get in. And then they were like, we actually were looking at your application. You should actually apply for the MA. So I was like, cool. So I applied to U of A for the master's, and then they were like, well, you're accepted and you're fully funded.
Oh, wow.
And nice. So I was like, I guess I'm going home. And then I think it was like the next day, NAU was like, hey, another person dropped out, so you're up for the funding package. And I was like, it's too late. Maybe I was being petty. I don't know. But I was like, no, I'm going home. I'm going home. So that's really how it happened. And so when I was there for the master's, I think my second year, I had a conversation. So there was an Africana Studies, there's an Africana Studies department, right, at U of A. And I would collab with some of them. And they had a really good talk. And I forget the professor's name, but I was telling her that I was thinking about PhD. And she was trying to convince me to like look elsewhere. But I was still in the mindset, like I'm home. I don't know if I can really do this, like going away and doing another 5 years somewhere else. I'm comfortable here, which I think it ended up working for the best. Sure. So that's the reason why I stayed with the PhDs, because I already made connections there. I already knew what the curriculum was like. I had mostly good relationships with the professors. And so I was like, okay, I'm gonna stay here then.
Makes total sense, man. For me coming up, I didn't even know certain schools were within reach short of a scholarship. And I share these stories in my workshops at times, but you know, the market in Boston for basketball or sports in general is garbage, dare I say. You know, these cats would rather recruit everybody from California. You know, it's like, we see you, Al Skinner, you know, coach of BC, wants to get all these other folks. All right, doesn't even look at your homegrown people. We had a brother by the name of Anthony Gurley, who was my guy at the time, who was clearly the best player in the state, clearly. And I was a top 10 player in the state, and I knew these dudes. He was clearly the best player. BC couldn't even land him. He wound up at Wake Forest. And then, you know, later on at UMass Amherst after some situations. But we had some talent that the home schools couldn't even grab. So when I went to college, I just went to play ball. I was like, oh, let's go play. When grad school came around, you know, you talk about how you didn't realize people chose grad schools, you know, for this reason. At least you had an understanding of what grad school was. I wanted to do something else, and my friend told me, my homegirl said, hey, you should apply for this position at this school. and for this program. I go, what is this program? HESA, Higher Education in Student Affairs. And she's like, oh, it's like a residence life degree. And you were an RA one time. So I said, oh, okay, great. Turns out to be much more than that, of course. But
yeah.
right, that's the only reason why I found myself there. And if I could have had it my way, I would have tried to find a school somewhere else. I just didn't know that I could apply in a different state. So I did all my stuff in Massachusetts as well. It's interesting how that happens.
For sure.
I want to read a couple of numbers to you.
Uh-huh.
And I want to ask you about these. In 2019, there were 2,512 Black Americans who received a doctorate, which is a total of 7.1%. This is up from about 6.5 about almost about 15 years earlier or so. And like a percentage maybe is the increase in 20 years. Is this number, or this low number of PhD recipients or EDD recipients for Black folks, is this a consequence of us as Black people, or is it systemic?
My initial reaction would say systemic, right? Just because I don't know that, and this is straight anecdotal, coming from my experience, I don't know that a lot of Black people I grew up with understood that how they got down, how they thought about the world was intellectual. And it's also, speaking from my field, a lot of the expectation is that to get a PhD means you want to be in academia, and I don't think that's true. But so that's why I say it's systemic, because I feel like I would hope that more Black people could realize that what they do is so intellectual and could be so much if they just had, and it's systemic too, because you need the support to do so. Like if they could just if they had the capacity, the funding to take 5 or so years to really like build that craft, build that thing, then I don't know. I think it could be so special. But I think we kind of turned, in my field, we've kind of turned the PhD into like, oh, you want to be a professor, so you have to do this thing, versus like PhD means like we're going to fund you to really sit and think through and build these things so that you can go out and do the work you need to do in the world. The work I want to do happens to be in education, so which is why I'm here, right? But also, if something happened and my university came to me tomorrow and was like, all right, it's quiet for you, it's time to go, then I know that my experience with my PhD allowed me an opportunity to think so critically about certain things that I can go anywhere in this nation and kind of do the work that I want to do. Right. Like I can be very intentional about where I go, right? But I think systemic, right, because I really wish as many Black intellectuals that I've met they've never been told that they were intellectual because they've been told that the way that they get down is not acceptable in certain spaces. Right. I really wish that they had that the capacity to do so. And I think that's part of my mission in this space too, is, how could I, as a professor, start to like create and cultivate some more of those moments and occasions, right?
For sure. And in that, what does it mean? What does it mean to be a Black man in higher ed, or even in the academy? Or I'll do you one better. What does it mean to be a straight Black man in higher ed or in the academy? What does that mean?
Yeah. I mean, for me, it means that at one point I got to hold and understand the expectations that come with that. Because in a lot of ways that there is some pressures against that, right? On the other end, it means that I need to do the work to understand why. So I love that you added the straight Black man aspect. I got to understand that straight Black men have done a lot of damage too. And there's reasons for that, but I think that we need to be very reflective of that, right? And say that to be a part to be a working part or a responsible part of the Black community, we need to acknowledge damage that straight Black men have done. Not to say damage hasn't been done to straight Black men as well, because of course it has. Of course. But hurt people, right? So like you got to acknowledge the damage you've done as well, and say like, if we want to also get better, then we got to acknowledge that. So on one hand, there's these pressures as like, I am an anomaly in the academy. On the other hand, it's like, but also in the space of the Black community, I got to be very upfront in saying like, this is the role that straight Black men have played. So if someone looks at me that way, I can't just be like, not me. It's like, yeah, I'm implicated in that. So teach me, tell me how to do better so that we can continue to build as a community. You know what I'm saying?
Very interesting. I like that that phrase you used there, hurt people. Very interesting. And I think about just a person who's been able to sit on both sides of the fence, student affairs and academic affairs within higher ed. There tends to be a clear exercising of racism that I've come across that is designed to sort of for the racist, right? To self-activate or to kind of to fulfill for them this preconceived notion they already have of what you're supposed to be or how you're supposed to behave. I remember coming to a position at the university, actually, and I was hired into a role that was an assistant director role, and the focus was diversity and inclusion, social justice. And I got there and I already had a grad student who was a young woman of color, who was a Black woman, biracial, Black, green eyes. And later on, I would find out that people would say to themselves, oh, why is Sherrod with her? Or he obviously just picked her because of how she looks. But the fact of the matter is, she was hired in that position before the job description went out. Right? So if I was a disabled white woman, she still would have been the grad student, right? It doesn't matter. But for them, the picture that fits best is, right, the straight Black man who is clearly, right, misogynistic or sexual predator, as they framed us in the past, right? So thinking about your perspective and my perspective, looking at both elements of, right, that Black male or even that straight Black male experience, and then some we hadn't even tackled, right, in more depth. It's interesting to see how that shows up and how that arrives. So what exactly is, let's transition a little bit to your work. What is hip hop pedagogy? What exactly is that? What does that mean?
It's recognizing that hip hop as a social cultural force has the capacity for intellectual labor that it's not often given. It's to say that specifically for Black and brown youth, and adults too, that hip hop is a way to help make sense of the world, which should be, in my opinion, the task of education in general, right? And so it's leaning in and recognizing that these worldviews matter, and we need to really think about what it means to teach through these worldviews, which is not to say that the white teacher who's never really rocked with hip hop should all of a sudden incorporate in their class. It's to say that we should give space for the student to express themselves in these other ways, and the white teacher needs to learn how to assess that in ways that are not going to be like, what's the word? But the white teacher needs to learn how to assess that in a way that's not pushing this integrationist model, like assimilate to what I think is the right way, but like, how do you want to make sense of the situation, and how should I assess in a way that doesn't really rely on this integrationist model of education? That's how I understand it.
Really at the core of cultural competency, at least the way I deliver it as a workshop, the celebration of differences.
That's exactly.
How can I make space, although my assignment is A, how can I make space when B arrives? And it meets the assignment as presented, but just in this fashion. A simple way is, I want you to do a presentation. Everybody's doing a PowerPoint, but you decide to do a shoebox diorama, right, or poster presentation. How do I make space for what looks to be a little bit different, although it meets the qualifications and the criteria? I love that. I imagine, right, Hamilton, right, as wonderfully as it's been received, right? I'm actually gonna go see it next month. I'm excited. My wife got some tickets. I'm not a musical guy at all, but this, it hits different, as you know.
Of course.
As lovely as it's been received, and everybody's raved about it, and the awards it's won, I have to imagine it's ruffled some of the feathers of the traditionalists, right, when it comes to history and to the way white narratives are to be told. What are your thoughts on the impact now that hip hop pedagogy and presenting hip hop as a tool to challenge norms and systems has been received.
Yeah. I think that we're still in a space where the practice is to look at, let's just stick with Hamilton for a second, to look at Hamilton and say, like, let's analyze how they talked about history. So let's analyze hip hop texts,
right,
versus a hip hop pedagogy perspective where it was like, how did they create this moment? What was the creative capacity that led to turning some of these like, you know, more tense political historical conversations into rap battles? Or what does it mean to even dream of founding fathers, if you will, as like Black and brown people? How does that shift our conception of history in general? I think those are the conversations that hip hop pedagogy wants to have. Is more so like, what does it mean to really radically reimagine the foundation, as opposed to like doing a textual analysis of a hip hop song, right? So how has it been received? I don't know that we're in a space where like we can even acknowledge that something like a hip hop epistemology, or like seeing and confirming knowledge through hip hop means is acceptable. I don't know if we're there yet. I think we're in the place where people are like, oh, hip hop is still here, so now I guess we should analyze this rap song and write a thesis statement about, you know, what this rap song is doing, versus like would teachers really allow students to just go up there and like spit a 16 right quick, and that is that enough for an essay?
Right.
I don't know. So I think there's a lot of space to go, but I think there's amazing work and scholarship who are pushing us in that direction. So I'm excited to see where it's going to go, because I think that one of the beautiful things and just kind of go back to the last answer, is that not only are students already coming in with this hip hop foundation, but now this next generation of teachers and instructors and professors and everyone involved in the space of education administration are also of the hip hop generation as well. Right. So I'm really excited to see what that might mean.
Yeah, I know. I was for a while, when I started in the higher ed sphere, I was a part of a group called Hip Hop Ed. I remember going to a conference. It was a round table, and folks just sat down in circles and just kind of rapped, not literally rapped, but, you know, just chopped it up a little bit about, you know, what role hip hop has in higher ed. And, you know, if we're looking at hip hop as Black culture, I remember when I was on the market way back, and I was looking to join a couple of different, you know, find a school to work for full time. Went to a job expo, and I met. I was being recruited at the time by NCU, North Carolina Central University, NCCU. And I met a few people who recruit me. They said, Sherrod, man, check it out. Why don't you come meet the vice president? I said, what? That level was that was like a level you couldn't get near. What do you mean? I'm a grad student who's trying to still graduate. Nah, come check it out, man. You know, he's over here. I forgot what the gentleman's name is. So I walk up into a rap battle, like to a cypher.
Oh, okay.
A legitimate cypher going on.
Yeah.
And he's in the middle, going in. And then he paused it. Sorry about that, young blood. What's your name? And it was the first time in my entire life that I ever came across a Black person, right? In this case, a Black man, in a professional setting, being 1000% authentically themselves. While wearing the title. I'm not talking. This isn't after 5 o'clock. Right? This isn't, you know, this isn't out at the bar. This is on the clock,
on camp,
at a job expo, right? With the thousands of people representing your university.
That's dope.
Pardon me 1 second. I got to finish this cipher up. I'll be right with you. What, right? And you know, that's when I knew, like, there is a space for this. It wasn't my field and my focus, but I knew that there's somewhere that Black folks can be authentically themselves. And we had to figure out how to normalize that. And so you took a journey to this. So talk to us a little bit about your dissertation and how you came to examining some of these elements. If you remember, it's been some time.
It's been a while, right? But I mean, I gotta start looking back at like my undergrad work, and there were a few moments in undergrad where some of my essays were talking about like what hip hop can do for rhetoric, and rhetoric and composition specifically.
Yes.
I mean, you go back to those things and you're like, oh, I mean, that's a lot of holes in the argument, but at the same time, that's where it started. So I've always had this interest in this engagement, and I think the reason why it really started, shout out to my guys at NAU. We would just sit and debate rappers all the time, all the time. So many different takes, and it was always recognizing that some of us had different styles that we liked. Like I'm not gonna lie, I was the boring dude who like wanted to listen to J. Cole at the pregame, and I was like, I'm not trying to hear that. But that was me. Like I love the like introspective. Like that was kind of how I got down.
You're a Tim Duncan guy.
I'm not. I am. It is what it is. It is what it is. And so like I would always think about those moments, and I'm like, you can't tell me that a group of mostly black men sitting in around this room like debating rappers, you can't tell me that that's not intellectual.
Right.
You can't tell me that that's not like rhetorical, really, like when we're thinking about like who we're arguing with and the points we're trying to make and how we get these things out.
Right.
And so every time I had a conversation, especially when I got to grad school, thinking about like the work we did, I was like, I mean, we do this though, like we already do this, we just don't have the language for it.
Right.
And I mean, so a couple of people I got to shout out. So one, the idea of DJing was always interesting to me. My dad was a DJ, nice. Not a hip hop DJ. Okay. I don't know if you like me saying that. He always tries to say whatever. But so we have records at my house, like vinyls.
Nice.
Kind of beat up, but still, it was always interesting.
Well used. That's all.
Yeah, well used. I like that. So it was always interesting to kind of go through and flip through, see what we had. I mean, some of them were my dad's. You can tell the funk records. Some of them were my mom's. My mom was big on she was big on like 80s R&B, and so like Anita Baker. Like when I hear Anita Baker's voice, I just think of my mom. Like that's kind of the vibe that she was in.
Nice.
And so that was always kind of interesting. And I grew up in aux cord culture, right, where you always wanted to be the one controlling the iPod and playing the songs, right? Yeah. So I always had that. I don't know. So there was always interest there, right? So I guess. Got to shout out Adela Lincona at U of A. She was the program head at the time when I first started my PhD, and we had to do these things called I don't remember. It was like critical cultural experience. It was the naming was really weird. I think she kind of recognized it was a little strange sometimes, and so I to try to fulfill that requirement, I asked her like, "Can I learn how to DJ?" She was like, "That sounds amazing." So it was one of those institutional moments where I'm so grateful that I had someone who was super critical. About how these things work, that I needed that affirmation. I needed her to say, yes, you can do this. And so then I might have mentioned before, I had an older cousin who hates all the rappers I like, but he was a big Tucson rapper in the community. And so he had a DJ named Spencer. Shout out to Spencer, DJ Alias, who I linked up with him, and he taught me a couple things and kind of got me started on that journey. And so when I started working with Spencer, I only met with him a couple of times, but in those times, it really messed up everything I thought I knew about like the process of like building songs, of breaking records and stuff like that.
Right.
And as I was going through that experience, I was like, this is like writing. This is the processes we talk about, how we go back and revise things and remix things. This is what that is.
Right.
So it's like, okay. So what would it mean to think of the DJ as a writer? What would it mean to think of the process of finding a break, of looping, of sampling, and how do we translate that in ways that make sense for students in the space of writing?
Sure.
So that was big to start that. Then of course I got to shout out Stephanie. You know what I'm saying? I got to shout her out because then when she came to U of A, it was like, okay, the frame makes sense, but like you're mentioning the resistance of it all. But like one, I think she helped me really understand like the literacy side of things.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that just took it to a whole nother level. Yes. But it was also like, okay, but like, who are you citing? Right. And,
right. Oh yeah.
And how can you make sure you're also remembering that Black women have always been in the space and have always impacted this space? And I think that's what it really like turned it up for me. Cause I was like, okay, if we're talking about resistance, if we're talking about that hip hop's doing all these things, like we need to make sure that who we're citing and the work that they're doing makes sense. So I think all of that came together, and I think that's where I got to my dissertation project, which is basically making an argument for the DJ as a metaphor or an image of what it means to be a writing administrator and a writing teacher, and how all those identifications change and challenge what we think about writing in the first place.
That's great, man. That's amazing. Yeah. I don't think I knew or
Yeah.
the element. And for folks listening, Stephanie, by the way, is my wife. Works with Eric as an advisor of sorts. But that's wow. And exactly the way you said she offered a helpful, healthy critique and to make you think deep. That sounds exactly like her. I mean, she journeyed me through my dissertation in ways as well as an advisor. To be honest with you, a whole different program. So I appreciate that. And it's actually a nice segue to my next question. I only got a couple more for you. And I know you utilized the feminist sort of lens in your dissertation because even my wife was your advisor. So I know that she's going to make sure that that's in there. We step back and think about hip hop. You already talked about Rhapsody. You talked about a few other women. Is there space for feminism in hip hop?
Yeah. I think there needs to be.
What does it look like?
Sorry, go ahead. What does it look like? Yeah. There absolutely needs to be. One, because women have always impacted hip hop. On the scholarly side of things, I think about Gwendolyn Pugh, who she has a great book called Check It While I Wreck It, when she basically talks about like how hip hop has tried to basically push Black women out of the public space, but the power of Black women's performance in hip hop has always shown a wrecking or a calling out directly to make space within hip hop. So these things have already been happening, and then like it's really funny how subtle rappers, mainstream rappers might even acknowledge this. So I don't know that I'm a big Drake fan anymore, but Drake was definitely the soundtrack for us, like in like 2009 until for me like maybe 14.
I was a huge fan as well.
Yeah. And I mean, I can say without any shame that Take Care is one of my favorite albums.
Listen, and hold on a second, because this is I want to be very clear. Anytime people have this argument about best albums of all time, I'm always loud and proud to make sure that gets in there. Always. For me,
it's a great word.
A 5-star album is one you do not have to hit skip on, and that is at the top of the list. And while I have the microphone before I throw it back to you, I maintain, and I could be off here, I'm fine with that, but the song Take Care, in my mind, is one of, if not the most well-written songs. Well-written. Of all time. Okay, back to you.
I see that. No, I see why. But no, so there's a track in Take Care. After Marvin's Room, the song is called Buried Alive, I believe. And it's Kendrick in it, right?
Yep.
And one of the subtle things he's kind of like talking about meeting Drake in that song. I'm assuming he's talking about meeting Drake in that song. And one of the lines he says when they're having their first conversation is like, we talk casually about the industry and how the women are the tastemakers for the stuff we making. And it's like, you're acknowledging that, right? That like women are already controlling like what sounds good and what is good rap music, what is good hip hop, right? So like, so why are we, if you can acknowledge that, why is this like larger hip hop community like trying to act like that's not true?
Right.
And so I think recognizing or calling for a hip hop feminism, it's not, I don't know. Maybe this goes back to what I was saying about straight Black men in the academy as well. It's recognizing that you don't have to act like white people to be successful.
Yes.
you don't. Like it's very white of us to be like, nah, there can only be one on top. Like, no, there's space for all of us. It could be beautiful if we kind of cultivate and create that space, co-create that space. So I think it looks like recognizing that straight Black men shouldn't. I forget the person who wrote that article, but he kind of talked about the title might be kind of sensational, but the point still remains where he was saying that like straight Black men are the white people of Black people, right? It's that idea. So we don't have to be that, you know. It's, right. And it's dope to acknowledge that that's not the case. And historically, it's not been the case. Like I think it was a big moment. I didn't really watch the verses, but I saw one of the clips I saw from the Big Daddy Kane when you like gave Roxanne Shante her flowers, right? Like that was huge. That's huge. To acknowledge that, yeah, this is already going on, right? So why are we acting like it's not? And why are we forcibly putting identities in hierarchy when we know that, to quote Kendrick, that Black women specifically have always been the tastemakers for music in the Black community. So
without a doubt. And you know, I sing all the time, man. I'm a crooner. I fancy the crooners, you know. So we're talking 20th century jazz and Nat King Cole, D. Martin, Frank Sinatra, you know what I mean? Some of these folks who, because, you know, I'm a little bit of a baritone bully, you know what I'm saying? And so I can't be out here as if I'm Bruno Mars, you know what I'm saying? So, right. But the women of that era, I mean, the Ella Fitzgeralds, right? The Billie Holidays, you know what I mean? The Black women who were really, really setting the tone in unmistakable ways for the future of music, as you're saying. Are the ones we have to give it up to, right? And I'm thinking a little bit about the line from Kendrick that I remember Buried Alive. Actually, I knew exactly what you were talking about when you said it, and how much of Black women's perceptive spot in hip hop, this idea of the tastemakers for what we're making, has to do with keeping the power away from them, though. If you had to change the content of a song, that moved away from, you know, the strip clubs or some other maybe stereotypical approach, and to Lib Kweli it or Mos Def it or Lupe it, is hip hop, mainstream hip hop, still the same?
It's a great question.
And I'm like, you know, there are rappers who are like, no, I make music specifically for this area, who right, and who sell, like Future, you know what I mean, a few of these folks, and you got the folks, you know, you got the Roots, who to hip hop heads are at the top of the list, but to mainstream folks, I'm not listening to this, you know, they're not talking about the right stuff.
And I think that, and this, I might be idealistic, but I'm gonna rock with it, see what happens. I think that the beauty of some of these acknowledgements is saying that it doesn't necessarily change the story. It just changes what characters you kind of allow to be visible in the story. Right. So I don't know if it changes. I think mainstream was inevitable because of the capitalist machine. I mean, we can have a lot of critiques about that, but I don't know that it changes the story per se, right?
Fair enough.
It just recognizes that the character who they tried to act like was just a supporting character was maybe a main character.
Right.
And that's fine, because I think that what when you acknowledge those changes, what it does is it signals to the younger generations and those who are not really familiar with the culture that like how we get down is different, right?
Right. You teach a course, or at least you taught one that was on theory and criticism. Okay. Do you teach that currently, or was that no course?
Yeah, I'm gonna teach that in the spring again.
Okay.
It's gonna be my second or third time teaching that class. Yeah.
And in this course, you engage in an exercise you call rhetorical critique, right? I want to ask you why this exercise is important and why you do it. But I want to flesh this out a little bit more and tell you about why I'm coming here. And for the sake of time, I'm going to put these two questions into one. Critical theories in general, race, agency, even feminism, as we just talked about, is in general heavily misunderstood, but even more so today in terms of its controversy.
Yeah.
Thinking about the class you teach and this exercise you do, can you explain what critical theories, such as the aforementioned agency, race, etc., what they are trying to accomplish and why either they're heavily misunderstood or why they should not be misunderstood? I know it's a lot, but
no, it's a great question. And I think these are the sort of things we try to unpack in that class. At least early, we have the sometimes two theoretical conversations. I say two theoretical because I think theory should serve the people asking it to. It should serve the questions that we want it to serve. And I kind of get this idea from Bell Hooks, where she was saying theory is a liberatory practice if we ask it to be, right? I might be, if I misquoted that specifically, I apologize, but it's something along those lines.
Yep.
Say it again?
I follow you.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So in that class, what we start with rhetoric and culture and talk about cultural rhetoric as a way to kind of view not only the world, but how language does things within the world. And I think the reason why I like to start with cultural rhetoric, because my understanding of cultural rhetoric suggests that we all should take note of the spaces and places we inhabit and how those experiences and histories impact why we feel the way we do about language. And which is, I think, to bring up something you were saying earlier, is to say that it could be, in my opinion, a beautiful thing when we learn how to live through difference, because difference to me is an inevitability that we shouldn't try to get rid of, right? So I think theory comes into play there when we realize that the process of theorizing or thinking through, to go back to Jose's quote, to the process of thinking through what's right around the corner that we can't see, doing so by recognizing our positionalities could be a very generative practice, right? There was another part of that question I want to make sure I answer.
No, I threw a lot at you. I was just asking you sort of why do you think these critical theories are misunderstood? And why should they not be misunderstood?
Yeah. Okay. So and answering that part of the question, I want to think about like the recent attack on critical race theory, right?
Right.
Theory is about trying to understand the world as we see it and trying to imagine new possibilities. But I think some people hear the language and assume that something must inherently be wrong with who we are.
Especially
yes
when we're critical.
And no. Yeah.
Right.
Yes and no, right? Like feminism isn't necessary if a gendered-based equality was a reality. Critical race theory isn't a thing if there was consensus that racial equality was a thing.
Right.
But I think we have hard lived experience, hard data about how that's not the case. And so if anyone's ever kind of worried about a theory, they're worried about not necessarily what's actually happening, but more so worried about the potential to change what's happening, which signals why there's some misunderstandings, right? I mentioned that I'm married to a white woman. Shout out to my mother-in-law. Like that's the last person I'd ever expect to have like a critical conversation about race. But like lately, we've been having like really impactful and powerful conversations about race. And I'm like, that, and it's moments like that where I'm like, oh, so the theories can make sense if we take them as opportunities to really reflect and really observe the world that we're living in, and not only from our own perspectives, but imagine how relative those are and how other perspectives might mean different things. That's where theory for me can change, because my mother-in-law, she's born and raised in rural Illinois, right? They've lived in rural places almost their whole life, but yet we're having like serious conversation about what her whiteness means, which is great, because I mean it'd be a very different family dynamic if we weren't able to have those conversations, right?
Oh yeah.
Which seeks that, and I think shout out to my wife too. Like we have a lot of conversations about like what race means, what does our relationship mean, and how do these things work out. Which is important. I think our relationship shows why something like a critical race theory is important, because I don't know if we would work out if she was like, race isn't real, you're just being, ridiculous. Like it wouldn't work because what she would be essentially saying is like, your lived experience is not real to me, and so I don't see that. So we're just going to keep moving from there. But what it is like, oh, so there's a capacity for us to really reflect on some of the privileges we were afforded. Not necessarily saying that we should do away with those, but saying, okay, if I'm in this space, what I'm going to do is like study and read and have conversations the best way I know how, so that we can really understand what's going on and maybe imagine that new possibility that we can't quite see, but we know might be just around the corner, right? So
especially if kids are in the conversation at some point in time, and that's when it becomes more important.
Absolutely.
Which leads me to my final question for you, my good friend. Again, thank you again for taking some time out your day and kicking it with us on the chopping block.
Of course.
It's a question a little bit loaded, so forgive me, but it's something that I have been in discussion with for a while with a few different people. My intro question really is, are you familiar with the very real but philosophical conversation between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois at the turn of the 20th century? Do you know at all what I mean by that?
Can you refresh me?
W.E.B. Du Bois wrote the sort of the book, The Soul of Black Folks.
Soul of Black Folk,
1903, right?
Yeah.
He writes
Double consciousness, all that. Yeah.
Exactly. He writes this in the middle of I say very real because it was discussion, but also philosophical conversation between Booker T. Washington himself. In short, right, the discussion is the future of the Negro, to use a language, right? The future of Black folks.
Yeah.
Booker T. Washington was suggesting what we need to be doing is getting ourselves into trades, because we're recently freed, 40 years, and this is what we know best. We spent centuries being in the fields, being in the sinks, being on the carpentry, whatever you name it, a smith of some sort. So this idea of doing something else would not best support the future of the Negro.
Yeah.
W.E.B. Du Bois is saying, I hear you, but that is limiting. Where we need to be is inside these universities, because that's where the power is. And I don't mean power to rule the world, but power to make real significant change. Start thinking about, as he called, the talented 10, right? And start imagining if 10% of us made up essentially the higher sphere in terms of access to power, and could really make a difference in our community. So it's this conversation about, where do we go as a people? Should we start pursuing higher education? And remember, W.E.B. Du Bois was from Massachusetts, Great Barrington, and the first ever Black graduate from Harvard, especially with the PhD, whole nine, right? So his perspective is different, it's privileged in a different way. And the conversations I find myself in as of late is in this ballpark, right? The future of the Black community, specifically with our children and our students. So I want to leave you with a question, pick your brain on whether we should be pushing our Black children and students towards more fields that generate community responsibility in a different way that might even lead to some wealth, like medicine, like law, like education, like business ownership, going back to the first thing we talked about early on.
Yeah.
Or should we continue to create space for our Black children and students to pursue careers in African American studies, gender and women's studies, philosophy, that will not, that 10 years down the road, when you're seeking a dentist in the Black community, you don't have anybody there. Or when you're looking to buy from a local corner store, it's not Black, it's everybody else. It's loaded, like I said, but I just want to pick your brain on all of that. Of course. You can start any way you want.
Yeah. I apologize if my answer is annoying, but shout out Adela Lincoln, who I mentioned earlier. She really got me on this wave back then. She's like, why are we always like assuming binaries and like having to do it either or with the situation? And like, what if we imagine a world where it was both and, right? Because like, systemic change suggests that we need like critical conversations, or so I should say we need critical conversations, but like we need Black people in all these spaces, right? In order for some form of systemic societal change. It can't just be the academy. We have a men of color group here at NMSU, and the conversation came up about like what does real change look like, especially here. And one of the things I said, and being here, I'm like, the academy might not be the saviors it wants to position itself to be. I don't think it is. I recognize the limitations of the work that we can and can't do, but I think we do important work at the same time.
Right.
I mean, I think Booker T. Washington's side of the thing makes sense. Like we need trades, like we need that area as well, right?
Right.
And so for some reason, I feel like as a Black community, we have so much, like we need to have a singular vision, and by which I think that makes sense. I think having shared ideals makes sense.
Sure.
But I don't think that the shared ideals suggest that we all need to do the same thing, right?
Yeah, indeed. Of course.
And so that's how I'd probably respond to it. It's like, why can't we be in all the spaces, and why can't we have a community that supports us in all the spaces? Because, last time I checked, I don't think white people are like, well, we can only be in this one way. They're like, no, and I'm not saying we need to compare ourselves to white people, but I'm saying
but I think that's a piece of the argument is, but granted, though white folks sound like we can only be in one space, you'll find a white doctor, you'll find a white dentist, you'll find a white lawyer, right? In ways that you won't find Black doctors, dentists, and lawyers, and there's other systemic reasons for that. But a lot of our Black students are wanting to become activists, as they should, in ways that deter them from joining some of these other areas that when you raise your kids, like, I want a Black dentist, I want a Black child daycare center, I want a Black, that they're either there or not there, depending on where they go in this direction.
Yeah, I mean, and so considering that makes sense, right? And it's, I don't know, it can't be the burden purely on Black people to always be the activists, because I don't know. I think you do need people in places of power, but also you need the people who are in places of power need to be critical people as well. They can't just,
of course,
kinda,
yes,
they also can't skate through on their blackness as the token black dentist, right? And say,
right.
well, I made it, so because that's not that I'm trying to slander any black conservative people, but if there's a common theme I've heard from like especially black conservative people, it's like I made it, I pulled myself up. And it's like, yeah, but like you have to look systemically, and like if you're this is really funny. Like one of my favorite books within the past I read in this past decade actually is Outliers. And I think so many people read Outliers and they're like, oh, I need to do my 10,000 hours and then I'll be good. But the argument is like that Malcolm Gladwell is presenting is like, it's not so much about doing your 10,000 hours. It's about having the support and the foundation and being able to understand why you were able to do your 10,000 hours in the first place. Right. So my critique for these Black conservatives who are saying I pulled myself up, it's like, yeah, but what were the reasons why you were able to, and why can't the rest of us do the same thing? And if that's not something you're worried about, then we need to have a conversation about who you're purporting to speak for, because it's not how it works.
Right. Beautiful. And then where has that fish hook gone? Did you throw it back right at us and to get full flag in here? Dr. E. House, man, I really appreciate you being here. This was lovely, lovely interview. I'm glad we got a chance to chop it up. Before I let you go, man, where can people get in touch with you? Do you have social media handles, publications, websites, podcasts, yourself, anything?
Yeah, I'm on both Twitter and Instagram. I'm not really active. I'm the dude who likes everything but never really posts in my life. But both Twitter and Instagram, I think my handle is at Mr. House Call.
Okay.
Football reference for those of you who don't really know about what house call means. But yeah, so you can find me there. If anyone ever wants to have conversations, I'm comfortable giving my email out. My email is eahouse@nmsu.edu. Hit me up. We can always chop it up about any of these things that I talked about. Yeah, I think most of my publications are in places that it's kind of hard to access. I think the only thing that you can kind of maybe see in the open space is I was a part of like I don't know what you would call it. It was in the summer of 2020, a site called Constellations, which is a cultural rhetorics journal. They hit up a bunch of Black scholars to really make sense of the moment and say like, okay, if we're talking about cultural rhetorics, what does this mean? It was a really dope kind of conversation we had. So go check that out. Yeah, and that's it. Hit me up.
Beautiful. Make sure y'all hit him up, man. Thank you all for listening. Dr. Eric House, Sherrod Robbins, and you're on the chopping block at visceralchange.org.